Hi, I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, host of Highly Sensitive Money. I'm a money coach, certified financial planner, and a highly sensitive person who brings money and social justice together. If you're someone who feels deeply, can endlessly think through how one decision affects everything else, or has ever struggled with all the things that traditional financial thinking leaves out, you're in the right place. In this show, I chat with highly sensitive people on how they handle their money, and with money experts on how they cultivate social justice in their work. Questions? Please go to allthecolors.net and schedule a free 30-minute call. And I'm happy to share resources on investment management, money coaching, workshops, or anything else money and social justice related. Join us in this episode as we explore money and sensitivity while honoring that all of our well-being is interconnected. In this solo episode, I'll share a deeply personal reflection on something I've struggled with for much of my life: rest. As a first-generation entrepreneur and the daughter of immigrant parents who worked endlessly, I grew up believing that rest was not necessary or even desirable. Today, I'm sharing stories of burnout, cultural expectations, and the slow process of unlearning hustle. From overworking during my time in LA to a transformative sabbatical in Costa Rica, I explore how I began to recognize rest not as failure or laziness, but as an essential input for my sensitive nervous system. You'll hear how honoring my limits has changed my work, my creativity, and my sense of worth. If you've ever felt guilty for needing to slow down, this episode is for you. Let's talk about what it means to reclaim rest on our own terms. Welcome to today's special episode of Highly Sensitive Money, where I will be recording a solo episode on rest. So as an entrepreneur, I have struggled with taking enough time to rest. And I want to share today some of the lessons that I've learned. I want to make some callbacks to some episodes that I've had with previous guests in this season. And I want to make a few invitations for people. So thank you so much for listening, tuning in today. And I'll get started on why this is a topic that I believe is important. This topic I'm really calling Rest as a First-Generation Entrepreneur Immigrant with Workaholic Parents. And although I may not be directly talking about money in this episode, I'm definitely talking about the systems of capitalism and extraction that are so prevalent. I'm also talking about understanding what it's been like for myself as someone who's highly sensitive to really give myself permission to take the rest that I need, because it has been a journey for sure, and one that I'm very much still on, that I still waver in and out of. So this has been a long struggle for me. Even before I was an entrepreneur, I struggled with rest. I remember being in LA, and at the time I was active volunteering. I was active at work. I had a full-time job. I was also studying for the CFP to become a certified financial planner. So there was a lot on my plate, and I was also dating. So I think I was learning how to dance. So I don't think I ever rested. And all of these were fun things for my growth. But now looking back, and even at the time, I could tell that what I was really happening is that I was avoiding being with myself. I didn't really know how to rest. Like I've shared in other episodes, both of my parents are entrepreneurs. And really this meant that, like, for a lot of people, time is money. And they could see that. I think I know that when we're employees, sometimes it can be easier to separate the fact that time is money because you get paid regardless of how much time you put in, especially if you're salaried. When you're hourly, that does change. But when you're salaried, whether you work 4 hours or 15 hours, you get paid the same amount. As an entrepreneur, though, you can see a difference. Not all the time. Sometimes, especially at the beginning, you can work a ton of hours and not get paid at all. However, over time, as you gain more clientele, as you gain more expertise, you see this translation. And both of my parents are hardcore workaholics. Like to this day, my mom very much still lives that way, and she would never consider herself that way. And my dad is not as much, but I do remember one time years ago when I was still an employee living in Philadelphia, he asked me, like, so you only work 40 hours a week? Like, what do you do with the rest of your time? Like, what do you? Are you getting a master's degree? Like, what are you doing? So I very much grew up with the idea that work was necessary and required. And what's interesting is that I come from a culture, a Mexican culture, where people really value rest, where people do not question. They think, hey, if you only work 4 hours that day, that's awesome. The rest of the time, just rest. So both of my parents responded pretty strongly to that culture by working as much as possible. And I think that's very common for immigrants. There's this self-selection that happens, like who decides to leave their home country to move to a new country. Sometimes it can be people who are refugees. Like if you're leaving a war, I think of everybody in occupied territories. I think of people who are fleeing war-torn places, who are fleeing economic uncertainty that's really, really real. Failed states. There's so many places where really people are fleeing because of life and death. And then there's people like my parents who were more along the lines of economic refugees in some way, that they saw the US as the land of opportunity. And it has been for them. It was thankfully for them. I've shared before that my dad experienced food insecurity as a kid growing up, and I never did, right? My mom didn't as much, but she was a la tercera palabra, how they say in Spanish, like at the third word, you didn't know what would happen. And I'm very grateful that they were able to create financial stability to the point where my brother and I never worried about food. We never worried about clothing. We never worried about electricity. In some ways, though, my parents continued, even when they had enough, they continued to work and work and work. And some of that was that we had family with need. So there were other family members that my parents were caring for. They were caring for us. And in capitalism, in our current experience of society, we're just taught to want more, right? Money can really be a way that we measure status. Money can be a way that we measure achievement and self-worth, whereas in other times, in other cultures, in other places, that could have been more through being like a pillar of society, or community volunteering, or learning an expertise. In most of US culture, it still continues to be more money is more status. I believe that's decoupling a bit. As someone who works in finance with top wealth holders, I can tell you that it doesn't always mean that. Like there are other experiences that they have to deal with that are not part of my experience. But I do want to share that I feel that more and more people are questioning this idea that your self-worth is related to your value. In fact, Monica Duarte, a guest earlier in this season, when I asked her, what do you think of the idea that you have to charge your worth? She was completely opposed to it, right? Because it's not possible. We can't measure our worth as human beings, our value as human beings monetarily. And as more and more of us question that premise, workaholism and constant striving for more is losing its appeal. So I shared at my first experiences of realizing that I didn't know how to rest, where it was in LA about 10 years ago, I believe, when I was doing all of those things. But then I really hit a wall and realizing that I did not know how to rest when I moved to Costa Rica. When I turned 30, I gifted myself a 1-year sabbatical. It was one of the best gifts that I've ever taken. I think also when I lived in France when I was a teenager, settling here in Mexico City, becoming an entrepreneur, I have lavished myself with many, many gifts. But this Costa Rica trip was incredible. And I went down there. Originally, it was going to be for 6 months. However, part of my money story is that before I went, I had loaned some money to a family member. And then this family member, there was a catastrophe that happened in their life. And I decided to cut my trip short by 2 months. I came back sooner because of financial fear, financial insecurity, whether this person was going to be able to pay that back. And they were eventually able to pay it back. But I did decide to cut my time in Costa Rica. But regardless, what I learned about rest in Costa Rica was that Ticos, as Costa Ricans call themselves, Ticos know how to rest. Ticos value more than constant productivity, like most Latin American societies. I remember the first couple of weeks that I got there, I was so used to go. I was used to waking up at 4 a.m. so that I could study, so before I went to work, before I did my volunteering activities and the other things that I was doing, this is way before I knew that I was highly sensitive. I was not attuned to my needs as a sensitive person at all. I was really white knuckling it. And also I think I was pretty numb because of how much stress I was putting myself under as a career changer. And also those were the tools that I had at the time. So I'm not dissing myself, but those were the tools that I had. And I remember maybe a month into being in Costa Rica, realizing that I wasn't able to both volunteer 40 hours and study the 20 hours that I wanted because I didn't have the energy for it. And again, my lack of energy has been something that I've hit a wall with over and over and over. And I feel that now I have finally figured out how to manage that, and I've given myself permission to just accept that as part of who I am. So again, I first decided to ask if I could volunteer less, right? Could I volunteer 6 hours a day instead of 8? And could I take half days on Friday? And of course, they were like, of course, yeah, you're a volunteer. Do whatever you need. I started doing that. And then I stopped setting a morning alarm. And I started sleeping more. And lo and behold, my retention for studying improved so much once I was no longer exhausted. I no longer needed to study 20 hours. I could actually move through the course at the pace that I wanted in 15. Because that was another reason that I had decided to take this trip. By moving to Costa Rica, I was lowering my cost of living. Even though I was no longer making an income, my cost of living was lower. And it would give me the space and time to actually prepare for the CFP exam. At the time, I was changing careers. And the CFP exam is, first of all, not cheap. It's expensive to study this program. It's expensive to take the courses that you need in order to prep for the test itself. There's all the courses, and then there's the prep course for the test. And then the test itself is also not cheap. So I wanted to make sure that I had the bandwidth emotionally, physically, mentally to really do my best for this exam. And there was one morning where I woke up late. I think this is before I decided to let myself sleep. There was one morning where I woke up late and I was so grouchy. And I was renting a room at the time from a fellow volunteer. And I went over for breakfast and I was kind of rude. And then I stopped short because I'm not a rude person. I am considerate. I don't move around the world disregarding other people's feelings as much as possible. I mean, I'm not walking on water. I'm not perfect, but I do try to be considerate. And I stopped and told her, you know what? I'm sorry. I was a little harsh in my response. I don't know what it was that I said, but I told her I'm stressed out because I didn't study the hour that I wanted to study before work today. And she may have been the one who told me why don't you volunteer less? Right? She might have been the one who incited that idea, or maybe I got it on my own. I don't remember. But fast forward another month or two, and I was rolling out of bed at 8 a.m. after 9 hours sleep, having breakfast and being like, I will study this weekend, or I will study in the evening. And she laughed so much because I had just shifted. My perspective had shifted. I remember this is probably when I was starting to really give myself permission to enjoy how sensitive I am around the sun and positive sensations and just giving myself time to rest. And it really was living in that culture that helped make that possible, because Ticos are really into community events. They celebrate all kinds of things. I mean, again, this is very similar to what we have in Mexico, but my parents were not like that. They, again, self-selection, who moves to the US, who immigrates, people who tend to fit into the new culture. So they had actually looked down a bit on rest and fun and recreation. So I had to get over my own socializing in order to learn to do that. And what's really funny is that although my dad looked down on it, he never forgot how to do it. He can still R&R like nobody's business. My mom has a little bit more of a hard time with it. She can still she'll crash when she's not working, but it's not, I don't experience her crashing as rejuvenating as the R&R that I see my dad do. So, it's their journey. But I do want to share how it impacted me of just like seeing these two examples and then going to Costa Rica and being like, oh, there's a giant carnival. There are days off all the time. There was a carnival when the McDonald's opened. It was huge. Like all of these people came to see this really like fun new franchise that was the first world entering their little corner of the world. And people took time off from work to come and look at the new McDonald's. Again, just different. So Costa Rica was a big turning point for me. I also remember thinking of my time in Costa Rica as a time of being fallow. Because when you are, this is an analogy from harvesting, from growing food. Not that I have any experience growing food. I do know, however, that if you are constantly using the soil, you will strip it of its minerals. You will strip it of the nutrients and it'll produce less and less. So what sustainable agriculture will do, what permaculture will do, is give the land time to rest. And I realized that that year's sabbatical was really time for me to rest, to step down and to just let myself lie fallow, which really speaks to the divine feminine, to deep intuition, to things that were happening not so much through me as to me. I think my body, my soul was demanding this downtime of me and I resisted. But I did eventually learn the benefits of it. And Costa Rica was a turning point for that. Then moving forward, after Costa Rica, I moved to Philadelphia, where I did experience balance while I was an employee there. At the beginning, when you're starting any career, there was a lot of work that I had to do. I remember coming to work. I was salaried, so sometimes I would work 10-hour days. Sometimes I would work on Saturdays. But I didn't feel depleted. And I also had come back from Costa Rica knowing how to rest a little bit more. Like my bath times were really important. Meandering walks around the city were really important. Developing deep friendships. And I had those things in LA, but they weren't as core to who I was until Philadelphia. All of that shifted though when I became an entrepreneur. I started All the Colors October 2020, and I remember coming home from work and being possessed by the muse, as one of my friends would call it, where I just would start working on my podcast, on my website. I would start working on my newsletter. I would start working on my programs, and I'd put in like another 2 or 3 hours of work at night. And then I'd wake up at 4 a.m, just like obsessed with how do I make this the best it can be. And even though I put in all of that work, I didn't hit like resounding success immediately. So then I just did more of what wasn't working and I just worked harder. I burnt out several times in my first year as an entrepreneur, but the really, really big deep burnout was June 9th, I believe, of 2022. No, it was June 9th of 2023. After a year and a half, almost 2 years of being a nomad and entrepreneur and also having my part-time work with Strategy Squad and Natural Investments, I hit a resounding wall. And I write about this in one of my newsletters. I'll link the blog here. One of my newsletter articles where I was trying to upload a photo onto a website, actually for the course La Bougette de la Lune. And I couldn't get the photo to load. I just, for the life of me, could not get it to work. And I just started sobbing. And I reached out to a dear friend, Jamie Clark, who asked me, when was the last time you had time off? And mind you, I was a digital nomad, right? So I was like in these beautiful locations, traveling all over Latin America, having an amazing time, but also not resting. Like expecting myself to be able to land in a new place and just start working. Now I look back and I know that I had to go through that experience because it was an itch that I had to scratch. I do love traveling, but I also see that I respect my downtime so much more now and I am happier because of it. But again, Jamie's question of when was the last time you rested really helped me open my eyes to the fact that I needed to. Thank you, Jamie, for for asking me that question, for holding space while I freaked out over not meeting a crazy self-imposed deadline. And from there, I took 3 months. It was 3 months. I was like from June until I was fully settled here in Mexico City by like September, October, when I had my apartment, when I started furnishing it, that I rested. I did not add any projects. I did not continue any projects. Really, I just worked on my existing clients. I worked on my existing projects at Strategy Squad, but I just let everything else go. And it was in October of that year that I had the idea of Highly Sensitive Money, where I really could start to speak more to my chosen audience and provide more free resources. So that fallow time, I believe, created the space for me to have this idea that I'm working on now. Now that I'm here in Mexico, I mean, Mexico does have, they call that Godin culture. And Godin comes from the show El Chavo del Ocho, where there was this guy who would, it's like Japan's salaryman. So there was this guy who would, his last name was Godin, and he would go to work in the morning and take his little meal in his lunchbox and then come back from work. And he had long commutes, and he was happy to be working in an office, but also he was like the slave to the office. So the Godin culture is very strong here in Mexico City and CDMX. So people, and there are all kinds of employers, just like anywhere in the world. There are employers that can be very extractive. There are employers that are more relaxed. I've heard that one of the differences in the culture between the US and Mexico is that in the US, we can be a little bit more like kowtowing, like brown nosy. Like if we make a mistake with our employer, we take it very seriously as like we've done something wrong. And here in Mexico, they can be like, well, we'll just figure it out. Like it's a little bit like less self-worth being tied to work. And you could also tell it. I grew up in California, where service at restaurants is spectacular. Like in California, maybe it's because the sun is better. Maybe we're just in a better mood. But people at restaurants are like genuinely very polite and kind and want to be there to serve you for the most part. That was not my experience in Philadelphia. And that is not my experience here in Mexico City. So no hard feelings to either of these cities. I deeply, deeply love them. But I think there's something of respect of like, yeah, no, you're my customer, but that doesn't mean I have to treat you like you're the best person on earth, that you're walking on water. In fact, I remember hearing, this is an HSP tangent. Again, for anyone listening, this podcast rambles because as an HSP, I've learned that is part of the way that my brain is set up. So here comes a ramble around why always being kind to the customer can be bad for our mental health. I heard on NPR years ago that when McDonald's arrived to countries from the former USSR, the Soviet Union, and they required employees to always smile, to always treat the customer kindly, people's mental health plummeted because it was not reciprocal. Right? It's very much one way. Like no matter how much of a rude bleep bleep the customer is, I still have to treat them kindly and with respect and as if they're right. And it's so dissonant to how humans actually relate to each other, right? If there's no relationship, there's no relationship, and there doesn't need to be an expectation to relationship. I think there might be like particularities to what Eastern European culture is like. But I also see that here in Mexico, and I saw it in Philadelphia of like, yeah, you're a client, but that doesn't mean that you're walking on water. That doesn't mean that I have to bend over backwards to be polite. And it varies, but I do see that people's sense of identity feels a little less fixed to work here than it does in the US. Although again, this is a generality. It depends what circles you move in. I think the more educated circles, the people with more education and like prestigious jobs might have more of their identity tied to work. But that isn't all over the place. Shout out to a couple of people who have been on this season of the podcast. So at the beginning of the year, I started working with the wonderful Doctora Ana Maria Lopez Caldwell. And she gave me this push, this gentle shove to start telling people more about my work as an investment manager. And I networked so much in January and February. I was having 30 meetings a week. It was unsustainable for me. And this is also when I was new to the Dr. Julie Bajalin's sensitive empowerment community, where I was just like, I'm drowning. I am networking so much. I have so many meetings. I don't have any time to do deep work. And I hardly have any white space. And Dr. Ana Maria helped me give myself more permission for rest. And I feel like this is echoed with, I reached out to Della Duncan, who was also a guest on this season, February 14th, when I was really at a crisis point of after 6 weeks of nonstop meetings. And even and because I had so many meetings Monday through Friday, I was working on weekends to catch up on the deep work. I was really burning out. By then, I already had some practices around how to care for myself. In fact, I established in December, so I've done this twice, December and March. For the solstice and the equinox, I give myself a week off from meetings. I close my calendar for that entire week after the solstice or equinox to both do deep work, to rest, to spend more time in nature, to do some of my personal things that I've just been postponing, and really to do some deep restorative rest. And that's been really helpful. And with the help of Della, she helped me see how could I do that more often? How could I limit my working hours? And these are things that are at some level, there's shyness in me to share them because they're so obvious. However, when you're in it, it doesn't feel obvious. And I've also, because I was part of the sensitive empowerment community, I was getting more and more feedback that this is normal for a person who's highly sensitive, that we do need more rest. And going back to my experience growing up, seeing both of my parents just hustle, living in a very hustle-centric culture in the US, me needing rest felt shameful, there was something wrong with me. But again, with Della Duncan's help, I implemented a couple more strategies. So every other Friday, I block off my calendar so there's no client meetings. And on that day, I can work, I can rest. I started volunteering at a local huerto urbano, a local urban farm. So that's something that I might do on Fridays. Or I might just do some of the deep work that I haven't had a chance to do because of meetings. And I also started setting up an alarm at 5:30 p.m. that says, wrap up, sweetie. And it's an invitation for me to stop working at 6. Sometimes I'm able to stick to it. Sometimes I'm not. However, I do better when I give myself that rest. And there's something so interesting in being an entrepreneur, a knowledge worker, and still struggling with overwork. I don't think this is everyone's experience, but I know that there are many people who relate. I love Pamela Capilad. She's got this really funny section of our podcast interview, where she says, you gotta talk about all of the work you're doing, all the jobs that you're covering, all the ways that you're being underpaid, and then show up on a panel to talk about it. And it's just, it's insane how this hustle culture demands so much of us. It's so exploitative, and we've internalized it. It's the epitome of internalized oppression to exploit ourselves the way that we do. One of my favorite authors is David Graeber. And I don't exactly remember if it's in his book, Debt, or The Dawn of Everything. It's in either one of those books. But he talks about how the ancient Greeks saw the ultimate goal of a good life to be leisure, time to think deeply. And nowadays, the ultimate goal is often to be incredibly busy and to brag about how busy we are. I'm not the first one to mention that people brag about their busyness. And in some ways, our addiction to status, our addiction to more and more and more enslaves us. It doesn't allow us the freedom to think. And people who have chosen to maybe under-challenge themselves at work in order to have more free time can sometimes be looked down on. As a highly sensitive entrepreneur who works with money, I really love this question of how do we decouple money status, sense of self-worth, autonomy. It's a question that each of us gets to answer on our own. I know that I am still very much in the process of learning it, but here I am again. In fact, the article that I'm linking to this post, I wrote last year. I believe it was in June of last year. And now here I am again talking about how it is part of a growing edge for myself. Yet I feel that as a lot of things in recovery, as a lot of things that we are growing or learning or integrating, the process is very spirally, right? You're going around and around. And every time I go back to that point of burnout, I may feel like, oh, I'm here again. Once again, I feel burnt out, or I feel like I'm on my way to burnout. But I see it more clearly. I see it with more compassion. I see it with more creativity and flexibility. And that is really a sign that I've experienced in other parts of my life of me growing and learning and being respectful. I also want to make a call out to the episode I had with Dr. Julie. It was episode number 2, where she talks about the highly sensitive brain being a supercomputer and that one of the inputs it needs is rest. So again, if you take anything from this podcast, it's an invitation to rest, an invitation to experiment with how to incorporate rest into your life, and really, really, really permission to consider rest as a primary tool for your own well-being, regardless of whether it makes you more productive or not. Rest is just yummy, which is actually something we talked about on Minachi's episode. So I am over here celebrating that, like 40 episodes into this podcast, the topic of rest has come up multiple times because it is a key ingredient for highly sensitive people. And I am here as someone who has gone from the extreme of constant overwork, constant stimulation, to really now learning how to incorporate downtime without guilting or shitting myself or requiring deep burnout or requiring myself to be sick, like physically sick, in order to rest. So shout out to anyone out there who is on this journey. Feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear, how have people learned to incorporate rest into their life? Is this something that they struggle with? Do they see capitalism as part of the problem around this construct? And how can we support you? As I wrap up this episode, I just want to say, if you're someone who struggles with rest, I see you. It's not easy to step away from the patterns we were raised with, especially when those patterns helped our families survive. But survival is not the same as thriving. And thriving, for me, has meant unlearning urgency, making space for stillness, and letting go of the belief that my worth is tied to how much I produce. Rest is not something I've mastered. It's something I return to over and over, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with gratitude. What I've learned is that rest isn't a reward or a luxury. It's a key ingredient for my sensitive nervous system. Thank you for being here with me. I hope something in this story helped you feel a little more permission to listen to your own rhythm, however it wants to move you today. Thank you for joining me on Highly Sensitive Money. I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, and I hope this episode helped you see how money and sensitivity can work together while honoring our interconnected well-being. We have the power to create a system where everyone's needs are met because nature is abundant. If you found value in today's conversation, please take a moment to leave a review and share this episode with someone who could benefit. Your support helps this message reach more people navigating their own financial journeys. A thank you goes to Mike Schul for the music and Juan Antonio Nunez for producing. For more resources on bringing money and social justice together, sign up for my monthly newsletter over at allthecolors.net. I also invite you to schedule a free 30-minute call where we can talk about money coaching, investment management, and all things money and social justice. Until next time, remember that your sensitivity and deep thinking is your superpower.